She answered the door expecting a delivery. Instead, there were two police officers standing on her porch on a quiet street on Australia's Sunshine Coast, and one of them was asking her a question that made no sense. "Are you Savannah Todd?" No, she wasn't. She'd never heard that name before in her entire life. Her name was Samantha Geldenoise. She was 20 years old. She was studying nursing. She had a mother she loved, a father who taught her to ride a bike, a brother she'd grown up beside, an entire life, 20 years deep, that felt completely, unquestionably hers. In the next 90 seconds, every single part of that was going to turn out to be a lie. Because the woman standing just behind her in the doorway, the one who raised her, protected her, built an entire life around her from the other side of the world, was about to be arrested for a crime committed 19 years earlier, in a country her daughter didn't even remember. And the little girl she stole doesn't remember it either, because she was 10 months old when it happened. This isn't a case where a stranger disappeared. This is a case where a mother looked at a courtroom decision she didn't agree with, and instead of accepting it, she rewrote her daughter's entire existence. A new name, a new nationality, a new father, on 4 different continents, and very nearly got away with it forever. The only reason we know how this ends is because of one slip of the tongue, 19 years later, in front of exactly the wrong person. Before we get into how she pulled it off, and how it finally fell apart, welcome to Vanished Women and Children, the channel dedicated to the missing persons cases that deserved more attention than they got. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. And drop a comment below telling me where in the world you're watching this from. I read every single one. One thing before we continue. This case involves parental kidnapping and disputed allegations of abuse. Some of what you're about to hear is difficult. Viewer discretion is advised. Now, let's go back to where it all started. Charleston, South Carolina. To understand how a mother could vanish with her own daughter and stay hidden for 19 years, you first have to understand the world she was disappearing from, because it's not the kind of place people expected anyone to escape. Olive Palm sits just off the coast of Charleston, South Carolina, a barrier island separated from the mainland by a stretch of marsh and tidal creek. It's the kind of place defined by what it doesn't have as much as what it does. No high-rises, no crowds, just wide beaches, dune grass, and streets lined with homes that have been in the same families for generations. A few miles inland, Charleston itself is one of the oldest cities in the United States. Cobblestone streets, church steeples that have stood since before the Civil War, antebellum mansions with wraparound porches built to catch the ocean breeze. It's a city that remembers who your family was 3 generations ago, and it has never been shy about it. Old money runs through it like the tide, quiet, constant, and impossible to ignore once you know to look for it. It was into this world that Benjamin Harris Todd III was born and stayed. Everyone who knew him called him Harris. He worked as a stockbroker, and by every account, he approached his personal life the same way he approached his work, carefully, deliberately, with a plan already sketched out before the first step was taken. By his early 30s, that plan included a wife, children, and a home on the same island he'd grown up on. He wasn't someone who stumbled into decisions. He made them. Dorothy Lee Barnett was something else entirely, and that difference is likely part of what drew them together in the first place. She worked as a flight attendant, a job that had already taken her farther from South Carolina than most people in Charleston society traveled in a lifetime. She'd backpacked through parts of Africa on her own, purely because she wanted to see it. Friends who knew her before Harris describe a woman who was magnetic in a room, someone who could turn an ordinary evening into an adventure without seeming to try. One of her oldest friends remembered her from childhood as a barefoot girl with bright blue eyes and a smile that never seemed to switch off. She was, by every account from her side of the story, warm, spontaneous, and fiercely loyal to the people she loved. They began dating in the fall of 1990. It moved quickly. Within a year, Lee had moved into Harris's home, and in December 1991, they married, the kind of wedding that Charleston's social calendar takes note of, with a guest list that mattered and photographs that would eventually end up filed away as evidence rather than keepsakes. On paper, they wanted identical things: a family, a house with a yard, animals, the traditional picture two people build together when they both believe they're building it for the same reasons. But the picture didn't hold. Almost immediately, according to Harris, Cracks began to show. Arguments that came on suddenly and escalated fast. Mood swings he later described as a darker, more volatile side hiding underneath the woman he'd fallen for. Lee's friends and family remembered it differently. To them, she was steady and devoted, and the real strain in the marriage came from a husband who worked 70-hour weeks. According to people close to Lee, had never fully embraced the idea of fatherhood once the pregnancy became real rather than hypothetical. Both accounts can't be entirely accurate. It's also possible that neither one is a lie. That two people simply experienced the same marriage in two completely different ways, the way people so often do when a relationship is already coming apart underneath them. What's not in dispute is the outcome. By the time their daughter was born, the marriage had already begun to fail, and the child born into the middle of it hadn't done anything except exist. She was about to become the single, most contested fact in both of their lives. Savannah Todd was born on May 6, 1993, in Charleston, South Carolina. She arrived with no say in anything that was happening around her, and within months, she would become the center of a legal battle that neither of her parents was willing to lose. By the time Savannah was still an infant, the marriage had collapsed completely, and Harris and Lee were headed into divorce court fighting over custody. What followed became the longest child custody trial in Charleston County history at that point. 13 days of testimony, competing psychiatric evaluations, and two parents each trying to convince a judge that the other one couldn't be trusted with their daughter. Harris's case rested on the argument that Lee was emotionally unstable. Psychiatrists retained by his legal team testified about sudden mood swings and what they believed might be an undiagnosed personality disorder. Testimony aimed at establishing that Lee's behavior made her an unfit primary caregiver. Lee's own psychiatric witnesses pushed back hard against that framing. They found no evidence of any personality disorder at all. In their assessment, there was nothing about her mental state that should have disqualified her from raising her daughter. Lee's argument for herself was more practical than clinical. She was still breastfeeding Savannah. She was the parent who was present day to day, and she argued that a father working 70-hour weeks in finance, however much he loved his daughter, was not positioned to be the primary caregiver for an infant who needed constant attention. The judge sided with Harris. Full custody was awarded to him. The written ruling didn't hedge. It stated plainly that Lee's psychological and emotional problems, if left untreated, would create what the judge called conflict and havoc in the child's life. Lee was granted visitation every other weekend. Nothing more. She did not accept the ruling quietly, and she did not accept it as final. Before the events that followed, Lee sat in front of a video camera and recorded a statement laying out her reasoning. In it, she described bruising she said she'd noticed on Savannah's forehead after a visit with Harris, along with what she believed was a bloody nose. Injuries she took as evidence that her daughter was being harmed while in her father's care. A neighbor who had accompanied Lee to pick up Savannah after that visit later corroborated seeing the same injuries. Harris denied any wrongdoing outright, and doctors who examined Savannah afterward found no medical evidence to support a claim of abuse. Years later, the FBI would seize nearly every copy of that videotape during their investigation. Every copy except one, which a close friend of Lee's managed to keep hidden for almost 2 decades before it ever surfaced again. Under the new custody arrangement, Lee was granted her first supervised weekend visit with her daughter. She did not bring Savannah back at the end of it. What the court had intended as a single weekend of supervised time became, instead, the last moment Harris Todd would see his daughter for 19 years. And what he didn't know yet, what almost no one around Lee knew yet, was that she hadn't left with Savannah on impulse. She had already been planning her exit for weeks. What happened next wasn't a mother panicking and running on instinct. It was a plan that had already been built, piece by piece, weeks before that supervised visitation weekend ever arrived, which is what makes this part of the story so unsettling. This wasn't desperation. This was preparation. Court records later revealed that earlier that April, before she ever picked Savannah up for that final visit, Lee had already obtained a South Carolina driver's license under a name she had no legal claim to, Alexandria Maria Canton. That license became the foundation for something far more consequential, a passport. By the time Lee walked out the door with her 10-month-old daughter on her hip, an entirely new identity was already active, already real, on paper, waiting to be used. Records showed that Alexandria Canton had booked a one-way flight out of the country, departing for Frankfurt, Germany, on April 23, 1994. That is exactly where she went. A 10-month-old baby. A forged passport in a stranger's name. A visitation weekend that quietly turned into an international disappearance. Dorothy Lee Barnett boarded that flight with Savannah, and by the time Harris Todd understood that his daughter wasn't coming home, both of them were already gone, off the radar of a legal system that, just months earlier, had spent 13 days deciding exactly who Savannah belonged to. He came home to an empty crib. No note. No forwarding address. No trace. Investigators would later piece together how methodical the disappearance had actually been. The false identities secured in advance. The international flight already booked before the supervised visit even began. The complete absence of any paper trail linking Alexandria Canton back to Dorothy Lee Barnett. It wasn't the kind of escape a person improvises in a moment of fear. It was the kind of escape a person spends weeks quietly assembling, piece by piece, while still showing up to family court like nothing had changed. By the time the FBI opened its case, Savannah Todd had, for all practical purposes, ceased to exist. And in her place, on a plane somewhere over the Atlantic, headed toward a country neither of them had ever set foot in, a woman named Alexandria Canton was holding a baby who didn't yet have any way of knowing her own name was about to change forever. For the next 19 years, two completely different lives ran in parallel on opposite sides of the planet. One built out of reinvention, the other built out of refusal to give up. Neither person at the center of them knew exactly where the other one was. And neither one stopped. Lee's story picks up in Frankfurt, the first stop on a route that would eventually stretch across 4 continents. From Germany, she moved on to France, then to Malaysia, then to Singapore. A woman constantly rebuilding a life from scratch in cities where no one knew her real name, with a baby who was too young to know it either. In a diary she kept during this period, addressed directly to her daughter, Lee wrote about how isolating those early months on the run actually were. Alone in foreign cities, with an infant who couldn't yet talk or walk, she wrote, "I hope one day that I might meet a man that loves you like I love you, and that's all I ever ask." 7 months into her disappearance, in South Africa, she found him. His name was Juan Geldenhuis, an engineering geologist. According to what Lee has said publicly, she told him everything. Her real identity, the outstanding FBI warrant, the fact that the child with her wasn't legally hers to have taken. He married her within months anyway. Asked later why things moved so quickly, Lee gave an answer that was as blunt as it was telling. She married him, she said, because he was already in love with her daughter. Dorothy officially became Alexandra Geldenhuis. She applied for an amended passport under her married name. And with that single administrative step, Savannah Todd formally became Samantha Geldenhuis, a new surname, a new father figure, and by that point, not a single surviving document anywhere in the world tying either of them back to Isle of Palms, South Carolina. The family grew. A son, Reese, was born. They relocated to Botswana, where Reese would later describe a childhood that sounds almost cinematic. Giraffes walking past the house, buffalo near the river, the kind of unstructured wonder that comes from growing up surrounded by wildlife most children only see in documentaries. It was fun all the time, he said. Samantha, raised in the middle of all of it, had no reason whatsoever to question who she was. One told her she had her father's smile. He told her she slept exactly the way he did. As far as she knew, because as far as anyone around her knew, that was simply true, because he was, in every way that mattered to her, her dad. After Botswana, the family moved to New Zealand, where Lee obtained citizenship in 2008. One more layer of legal legitimacy stacked on top of an identity that had already survived over a decade of scrutiny. Eventually, after 13 years spent moving across 4 continents, the family settled permanently on Australia's Sunshine Coast, a stretch of coastal Queensland about as geographically distant from Charleston, South Carolina, as it is possible to get. Juan and Lee eventually divorced, but the family stayed intact around Samantha and Reese. Samantha finished school, enrolled in nursing at James Cook University, built a circle of friends, adopted pets, took dance lessons. By every measure visible to her, she had an ordinary, happy, unremarkable life, which is precisely what made it so completely convincing. Harris's story, running in parallel, looked nothing like that. He described the moment he realized Savannah was gone as instant horror, an empty crib, and a silence in the house that had no bottom to it. He refused to treat it as permanent. He appeared on Unsolved Mysteries. He appeared on America's Most Wanted, working directly with host John Walsh to film a public service announcement pleading for his daughter's return. He went on Montel Williams and Sally Jesse Raphael, put his daughter's face on flyers distributed nationwide, and offered a $5,000 reward for information. He filed a civil lawsuit against Lee and was awarded $50 million in damages, an amount both sides understood he'd likely never actually collect, but one that represented the legal system formally acknowledging just how much had been taken from him. He hired private investigators. He deposed Lee's friends, her extended family, her brother, anyone he believed might know something. Those close to Lee later described the scrutiny as relentless and financially punishing. Harris's position never wavered. He would do whatever it took to find his daughter. The FBI classified Lee as a federal fugitive, placing her on their wanted list on charges of international parental kidnapping and passport fraud, charges that carried significant prison time if she were ever caught. Year after year, she wasn't. As the years stretched on, Harris kept recording video messages meant for a daughter who couldn't hear them, who didn't know he existed, who was growing up somewhere out there under a name he'd never even heard. In one of those recordings, he said, "Losing you took most of the life out of me, and I sometimes feel like I'm already dead and just haven't fallen over yet." That is what 19 years of not knowing does to a person. 2 lives, running the entire time on opposite sides of the world. One built on reinvention so complete it fooled a child for 2 decades, the other built on a refusal to stop looking that never once let up. Nearly 2 decades of careful reconstruction, 4 continents, 3 names, an entire family built around a secret, came apart because of a single word, spoken without thinking, in front of exactly the wrong person. At some point, no one has ever pinned down precisely when, Lee referred to her daughter as Savannah instead of Samantha, in front of a friend who had only ever known the family as Alex and Samantha Geldenhuys. 1 syllable, the old name, the real one. It slipped out before she had time to catch it, the way names do when they've been buried for so long that the mind occasionally forgets to guard them. The friend noticed. It was odd enough, out of place enough, that it stuck. And once something like that lodges in a person's memory, it tends not to let go. It sits there, quietly, until it's given a reason to matter. That friend eventually reached out to Harris Todd directly. Around the same time, an Australian couple who had known the family for years separately sent Harris an email confirming they'd known Dorothy and Samantha for years under exactly those names, Alexandra and Samantha Geldenhuys. They included a photograph. Harris looked at that photograph and recognized her immediately. 19 years had passed. The name was different. The country was different. The life around her was completely different. But the woman in that photo was unmistakably the same one who had disappeared with his daughter on a flight to Frankfurt in April 1994. He now had a name. He had a location, the Sunshine Coast, Queensland, Australia. And after 19 years of dead ends, television appeals, and private investigators who had never gotten this close, that was finally enough for law enforcement to move. It wasn't sophisticated surveillance that ended this. It wasn't a breakthrough in international data sharing or a facial recognition match run through some FBI database. It was 1 syllable, said out loud, in front of someone who happened to be paying just enough attention to notice something was wrong. It was a Tuesday morning in November 2013. Lee was at home, on the phone, when the knock came. She opened the door to find officers standing outside with a warrant for her arrest. Samantha wasn't there. She learned what was happening the way most life-altering news arrives now, by phone. Lee called her from custody at 7:30 that morning. What followed was a sentence that, at first, made no sense at all. "You know how we've never had any contact with family or friends in the U.S.?" Lee said, "Well, I was married before. I'm going to jail now because I've been accused of kidnapping you. I did it because I had to keep you safe." Samantha later said she remembered every single second of that call, because it was the exact moment her entire world quietly rearranged itself. Not shifted, not wobbled, but permanently changed shape. And her first thought, before there was time to process any of the rest of it, wasn't about crimes or courts or countries. It was simpler than that. and in some ways worse. Does that mean Dad isn't my dad? The following day, FBI agents sat her down and, piece by piece, told her who she actually was. They told her about a baby named Savannah Todd, born in Charleston, South Carolina, on May 6, 1993. They told her about a 13-day custody trial and a judge's ruling. They told her about a supervised visitation weekend that never ended, a forged passport under the name Alexandria Canton, and a flight to Frankfurt taken on April 23, 1994. They told her she had spent 19 years as the subject of an active federal fugitive investigation, one her own mother had spent those same 19 years successfully evading. And they told her about a man named Harris Todd, who had gone on national television, hired investigators, and recorded video messages for nearly 2 decades, waiting for a daughter who had no idea any of it was happening. That's when I learned when I was born, Samantha said afterward. I learned Savannah. I didn't know anything before that. She was 20 years old. Everything she had built her sense of self around, her name, her nationality, her father, the entire shape of her personal history, had just been rewritten for her in the space of a single conversation by strangers in a room she hadn't chosen to be in. And her reaction wasn't what anyone might have expected. She didn't turn on her mother. She defended her. Every characteristic they said that my mother had was wrong and incorrect, Samantha said. Every single thing. When agents raised the old allegations from the 1994 custody case, the claims about instability, the suggestion of an undiagnosed disorder, the very testimony that had costly custody in the first place, Samantha said she actually laughed in their faces. Not out of disrespect, out of pure disbelief. She said she had never, in her entire life, witnessed anything close to what they were describing. This is where the story stops being simple, because Samantha hadn't grown up hidden in fear or neglect. She'd grown up loved, completely, consistently, devotedly, by a woman who had given up her country, her family, and her own name to keep her. Whatever the law said about what Dorothy Lee Barnett had done, the daughter sitting across from those FBI agents had grown up with everything a child could reasonably want: friends, animals, an education, a mother, a father, a brother, a home. It was normal, she said later. It was so normal. How do you hold both of those truths at once? That the woman who built your entire world out of a lie is also the woman who built your entire world out of love. Samantha didn't have an answer to that question on the day she learned who she was. In some ways, she's still living inside it. Dorothy Lee Barnett was extradited from Australia back to the United States, returned to Charleston, South Carolina, the exact city she had vanished from, with her daughter 19 years earlier. It's hard to overstate how strange that return must have been. The same courthouse system, the same jurisdiction, nearly 2 decades later, now facing federal charges instead of a custody dispute. She was charged with international parental kidnapping and making false statements on a United States passport application. She ultimately pleaded guilty to both. The sentence, 21 months in prison, followed by 2 years of supervised release. With credit applied for time already served since her arrest that November, Lee was out of custody in roughly 4 months. To many people who followed the case closely, that sentence felt strikingly disproportionate to what had actually happened. This was a woman who had removed a child from her legally appointed custodian, constructed and used a forged identity to do it, evaded federal law enforcement across 4 continents for nearly 2 decades, and kept a father entirely in the dark about his own daughter's existence for 19 years. Set against all of that, for months served raises an uncomfortable but fair question. Would a stranger, someone with no biological claim to the child at all, who had done exactly the same thing, have received anywhere close to the same sentence? Almost certainly not. Harris, for his part, didn't push for harsher consequences. His public response was measured, almost startlingly so, given everything he'd lived through. I don't care if I ever see her ever again, he said of Lee. But I have no animosity for her. She's my daughter's mother, and that's what she is, and that's what she'll always be. His stated focus wasn't punishment. It was the daughter he had just found, after 19 years of searching for her without ever finding a single solid lead. But the sentence itself still leaves a question this case can't fully resolve. Parental abduction is treated differently under the law than a stranger abduction. The presence of parental love appears to soften how courts weigh the harm. even though the child at the center of it experiences the same fundamental loss either way. 19 years of a father who wasn't allowed to know her, and 19 years of a legal identity that had been erased and replaced without her consent. The law, in this case, arrived at an answer that satisfied almost no one who looked closely at what had actually been taken from Harris, and in a different, but equally real way, from Samantha herself. The reunion between Harris Todd and the daughter he had spent 19 years searching for did not happen the way anyone might picture it after 2 decades of waiting. There was no tearful airport embrace, no instant reconciliation. What happened instead was slower, more guarded, and in its own way, more honest. Samantha didn't rush toward him. Before she was willing to open any kind of door to a relationship, she wrote him an 8-page letter, asking him to respond directly to every allegation that had ever been made against her mother, the claims of instability, the accusations from the original custody case, all of it. She needed to hear his side of the story in full, in his own words, before she could decide what kind of place he might have in her life. In 2014, she traveled to the United States to support Lee through the legal proceedings that followed, and while there, she reconnected with her mother's side of the family for the first time. She didn't meet Harris in person until 2015, a full 2 years after learning he existed. When she finally did, she was direct about what she needed from him going forward. "I can have the most amazing relationship with him," she said, "as long as I am 100% sure there's no revenge, no spite, no nothing." That isn't the language of a daughter rejecting her father. It's the language of a young woman trying to navigate an almost impossibly complicated situation with more care and clarity than most adults could manage under far less pressure. According to those close to him, Harris never asked her to choose sides. What he wanted, his attorney has said, was simply for her to be safe, happy, and well. Today, Samantha is in her 30s. She kept the name Geldenhuis, the one she grew up with, the one that still feels like hers regardless of what any birth certificate says. She completed her nursing degree at James Cook University and now works as a nurse near the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. In 2019, she married a man named Bradley Stevens. The wedding took place in Fiji, not in Australia, and not in the United States. The reason is its own kind of quiet statement. Dorothy Lee Barnett remains barred from re-entering Australia following her conviction, and Samantha wasn't willing to get married without her mother in the room. So she moved the entire wedding to another country, across an international border, so that her mother could be there. Whatever anyone believes about what Dorothy Lee Barnett did 19 years earlier, that single decision says something almost impossible to argue with. The daughter she raised chose, without hesitation, to restructure one of the most important days of her life around making sure her mother could be part of it. That is what 19 years of devotion built. Even devotion that began with a forged passport and a flight to Frankfurt. Dorothy Lee Barnett, now in her mid-60s, continues to be barred from Australia. She has spoken publicly about how difficult the distance from her daughter has been. "I don't want to get our hopes up," she said, "as it always tears us apart. It's so devastating." Meanwhile, Harris Todd, the man who once said that losing his daughter took most of the life out of him, has built something real with Samantha, even if it isn't the reunion he imagined during all those years of recording messages to a daughter who couldn't hear him. It's careful. It's still being built. But after 19 years of nothing, something is everything. There is a diary that Dorothy Lee Barnett kept during the earliest days of her disappearance. Started in a foreign city, alone, with a 10-month-old baby on her knee and an entire life she'd have to invent from nothing. She addressed it to her daughter, using the name almost no one outside their world would hear again for 19 years. The first page reads, "To my dear Savannah, someday I'll give this journal to you so that you can hopefully understand your mother." She did eventually give it to her, and Samantha read every word. Whether you read that diary as the private record of a mother who sacrificed everything to protect her child, or as the record of a woman who never fully reckoned with what she had taken from someone else, the truth is that both readings can sit in the same document without canceling each other out. Dorothy Lee Barnett gave up her country, her name, her family, and 19 years of freedom to keep her daughter close. She also took 19 years away from a father who had done nothing to deserve losing them, and she took from her daughter the basic right to know who she actually was. There are people who will hear this story and see a mother who loved her child so fiercely that she was willing to burn her entire life down rather than be separated from her. There are others who will see a woman who committed a serious federal crime and denied a father 19 years of his daughter's life, dressing the harm up as protection. Both of those things are true at the same time. This case doesn't offer the comfort of only having to choose one. What isn't complicated, though, is this. Savannah Todd was 10 months old when all of this began. She had no vote in the custody trial, no voice in the decision to fly to Frankfurt, no say in any of the names she was given or the country she was raised in. Every adult involved in this story, on every side of it, made choices that permanently shaped the life of a child who wasn't old enough to understand that choices were even being made. And the system that was supposed to protect her, the FBI, international law enforcement, the entire legal framework built to handle cases exactly like this one, didn't find her for 19 years. Not because she'd been hidden with extraordinary sophistication, though she had been, but because international parental abduction has historically been treated as a lesser category of crime, complicated by the fact that it comes wrapped in parental love, something courts and investigators alike have never quite settled on how seriously to take. Savannah is Samantha now, and Samantha has built something real and steady out of a beginning that gave her no say in anything. She's a nurse. She's a wife. She's a woman who has chosen, with more generosity than most people could manage under the same circumstances, to hold space for both of the parents who shaped her, the one who raised her, and the one who spent 19 years looking for her, without letting the weight of either one destroy her. But she should never have had to do that work in the first place. She should have known who she was from the beginning. So here's the question this case leaves behind, and I want to know where you land on it. Was Dorothy Lee Barnett a mother protecting her daughter from a court decision she believed was wrong? Or was she a woman who committed a serious crime and spent 19 years justifying it as love? You can believe both. Most people who follow this case do. Tell me in the comments. And if you're new here, this is Vanished Women and Children, the channel covering the missing persons cases that deserve more attention than they got. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and share this with someone who'd want to hear it. Because after 19 years of silence, this story only stayed buried for as long as no one was talking about it. Until next time, stay safe.